Alrighty, sorry about the delay, sorry about the late start, but welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we've got the second to last, the penultimate installment of the Fall of Hyperion, and indeed the Hyperion Cantos. Get hyped. A lot's going to go down this time around. Some serious climax and climactic events to be followed by the actual finale next week, which I am also looking forward to. Things got fairly wild last time. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele and Derpy Shark. Thank you very much. Hello. Thank goodness it is Friday. Oh man, that's hot. Oh, my tongue. What will I ever do? Okay, so what happened last time? Let's see. Kassad is fighting off the Shrike. Braun Lamia is awake without an alien tentacle stuck in her brain. Rachel has been absconded with. Oh, yes. So the consul has met with the ousters and is about to have a kind of a trial, if you will, a real sit down to do diplomacy with the ouster fleet at Hyperion to see if they can just back off a little bit and stop nuking hegemony worlds into the ground, to the bedrock. Just a little something. Let's see what else has happened. Hegemony fleets are engaging ouster swarms at locations other than Hyperion to see if they can slow them down. More on that later. The biggie, of course, is that the Severn-Keats hybrid, has met with Pappy Ummon, the AI, Quats, and received a bunch of cryptic, if sage, background into just how the AIs work. So the AIs basically live in the infinitesimal / infinite spaces between wormholes. And they piggyback on the hardware and wetware that we have going on. So our brains and the implants that everybody has implanted in them as a member of the hegemony in order to run. If this seems familiar, that's because the Matrix would later do something not entirely dissimilar. Basically the same logic. Except we're not necessarily batteries, but they are running on us, more or less. There's also other, all the other computational infrastructure of the hegemony they also are using to some extent, but mostly they live in these spaces between wormholes. And every time a human being is transitioning through a wormhole, they're piggybacking on us and using our processing power, our neurons, to do what they're doing, if I understand correctly. Right now, there is a war in AI-ville because the Volatiles and Ultimates are like, yo, kill the humans and we will ascend and become one with the machine UI. And Ummon's group, the stables, are like, we didn't really sign up for this because, the whole dying thing sounds like it sucks. So we're not into that. So there's a war in heaven. I don't actually know if the Volatiles definitely want humanity gone. The practical upshot of killing off humanity is apparently this will precipitate what's the term I'm looking for? There's a specific term. The advent. There we go. Precipitate the advent of the machine UI coming into existence. This does have something to do with the labyrinth tunnels. I don't think that's a spoiler at this point. I think people are probably figuring that out. Failing that, well, we'll get there. There's a lot going on. There's a bunch of stuff that I've missed and not covered, but that's kind of the gist of what's going on. Big spoilers if you're tuning into this without tuning into any of the other ones. Huge spoilers. kind of fundamental, in fact. So sorry, but they happened last time, so they're not spoilers now. Linear continuity of time is funny that way. They will be spoilers if you're tuning into this out of order. Hopefully not. Uh, it's pretty big. Um, there's something else related to the ousters, I think, but I can't remember what it is. Something is afoot, I think, with the ousters that aren't invading Hyperion, the other ouster swarm fleets. But I don't remember if they said what it was, so I'm not going to mention it. Um, because it will become clear later. I think possibly this installment. Anyway, oh, and Kassad's still fighting the Shrike. I think I mentioned that already. He's still fighting the Shrike. So things are coming to a climax. They are coming to a head. Um, get hyped. Alrighty, let me just get a little water in me, and we'll get cracking. Um, I hope people are enjoying these. I know I certainly am. I know there's been one or two people who have been made themselves known in the comments for um, I think it was specifically for uh, what are the last two novels of the Area X trilogy? Authority and Acceptance. They haven't been too thrilled. I'm sorry to hear that. Uh, if you're wondering why these are rough, it's because I do them live. Um, they are not edited after the fact, partly as an artistic, in quotes, design choice, and partly because I'm lazy. It's all about time. You know, in a way, the Hyperion Cantos is all about time. Sort of. And, God fragments being sent back and forward through it, and the Shrike. I think, yes, it's been revealed already that that the Shrike is kind of non-determined at this point. There's a big chunk of the book where you have no idea what the Shrike is. Then it's like, oh, the Shrike. We get some revelations about what's going on with the AIs, and it's like, oh, the Shrike is clearly an AI machine agent designed to ensure that ultimately that the machine UI comes into existence. And now it's like, oh, well, the Shrike is also maybe an avatar of humankind, the human UI as well, to ensure that that comes into existence. So the Shrike is in this really awkward, confusing quantum probability thing where it's like, the Shrike definitely happens, but how the Shrike happens and who the Shrike is working for are very much up in the air, and that is yet to be determined by events going forward. It's actually a pretty cool way of looking at, hey, um, you know, not necessarily future timelines, but okay, how undetermined is this timeline stuff? You have something that definitely shows up, but it could be coming from either angle, and you don't know until that becomes an observed reality or not. So it's actually pretty cutely done, I feel. Um, I don't think I just spoiled anything. No, that's been talked about already. That's been talked about. Um, that it's unsure. Yes, I'm pretty sure I have not just spoiled the Shrike at this point. I will feel really terrible. No, they've brought it up. They've brought it up. We're good. We're good. We're good. I'm gonna drink some water and we're gonna get cracking. Chapter 42. Colonel Fedman Kassad died in battle. Still struggling with the Shrike, aware of Moneta only as a dim blur at the edge of his vision, Cassad shifted through time with a lurch of vertigo and tumbled into sunlight. The Shrike retracted its arms and stepped back, its red eyes seeming to reflect the blood splashed on Cassad's skin suit. Cassad's blood. The colonel looked around. They were near the Valley of the Time tombs, but in another time, a distant time. In place of the desert rocks and the dunes of the barrens, a forest came to within half a click of the valley. In the southwest, about where the ruins of the poet's city had lain, in Cassad's time, a living city rose, its towers and ramparts and domed gallerias glowing softly in the evening light. Between the city on the edge of the forest and the valley, meadows of high green grass billowed in soft breezes, blowing in from the distant bridal range. To Cassad's left, the valley of the Time tombs stretched away as always, only the cliff walls were toppled now, worn down by erosion or landslide and carpeted with high grass. The tombs themselves looked new, only recently constructed, with workmen's scaffolds still in place around the obelisk and monolith. Each of the above-ground tombs glowed bright gold, as if bound and burnished in the precious metal. Sorry about that. The doors and entrances were sealed. Heavy and inscrutable machinery sat around the tombs, ringing the Sphinx, with massive cables and wire-slender booms running to and fro. Cassad knew at once that he was in the future, perhaps centuries or millennia in the future, and that the tombs were on the verge of being launched back to his own time and beyond. Cassad looked behind him. Several thousand men and women stood in row upon row along the grassy hillside where once a cliff had been. They were totally silent, armed, and arrayed facing Cassad like a battle line awaiting its leader. Skin-suit fields flickered around some, but others wore only the fur, wings, scales, exotic weapons, and elaborate colorations which Cassad had seen in his earlier visit with Moneta to the place/time where he had been healed. Moneta. She stood between Cassad and the multitudes, her skin-suit fields shimmering about her waist, but also wearing a soft jumpsuit, which looked to be made of black velvet. A red scarf was tied around her neck. A rod-thin weapon was slung over her shoulder. Her gaze was fixed on Cassad. He weaved slightly, feeling the seriousness of his wounds beneath the skin suit, but also seeing something in Moneta's eyes which made him weak with surprise. She did not know him. Her face mirrored the surprise, wonder, awe, which the rows of the other faces showed. The valley was silent except for the occasional snap of pennant on pike or the low rustle of wind in the grass as Cassad gazed at Moneta and she stared back. Cassad looked over his shoulder. The Shrike stood immobile as a metal sculpture 10 meters away. Tall grass grew almost to its barbed and bladed knees. Behind the Shrike, across the head of the valley near where the dark band of elegant trees began, hordes of other Shrikes, legions of Shrikes, row upon row of Shrikes, stood gleaming scalpel sharp in the low sunlight. Cassad recognized his Shrike, the Shrike, only because of its proximity and the presence of his own blood on the thing's claws and carapace. The creature's eyes pulsed crimson. "You are the one, aren't you?" asked a soft voice behind him. Cassad whirled, feeling the vertigo assail him for an instant. Moneta had stopped only a few feet away. Her hair was as short as he remembered from their first meeting, her skin as soft-looking, her eyes as mysterious with their depths of brown specked green. Kassad had the urge to lift his palm and gently touch her cheekbone, run a curled finger along the familiar curve of her lower lip. He did not. "You're the one," Moneta said again, and this time it was not a question. "The warrior I've prophesied to the people." "You don't know me, Moneta?" Several of Kassad's wounds had cut close to bone, but none hurt as much as this moment. She shook her head, flipped her hair off her forehead with a painfully familiar movement. "Moneta, it means both daughter of memory and admonisher. That is a good name." "It's not yours?" She smiled. Kassad remembered that smile in the forest glen the first time they had made love. "No," she said softly, "not yet. I've just arrived here. My voyage and guardianship have not yet begun." She told him her name. Kassad blinked, raised his hand, and set his palm along her cheek. "We were lovers," he said. "We met on battlefields, lost in memory. You were with me everywhere." He looked around. "It all leads to this, doesn't it?" "Yes," said Moneta. Kassad turned to stare at the army of shrikes across the valley. "Is this a war? A few thousand against a few thousand?" "A war," said Moneta. "A few thousand against a few thousand on 10,000,000 worlds." Kassad closed his eyes and nodded. The skin suits served as sutures, field dressings, and ultramorph injector for him, but the pain and weakness from terrible wounds could not be kept at bay for much longer. 10,000,000 worlds, he said, and opened his eyes. A final battle, then? Yes. And the winner claims the tombs? Moneta glanced at the valley. The winner determines whether the shrike already entombed there goes alone to pave the way for others. She nodded toward the army of shrikes, or whether humankind has a say in our past and future. "I don't understand," said Kassad, his voice tight. "But soldiers rarely understand the political situation." He leaned forward, kissed the surprised Moneta, and removed her red scarf. "I love you," he said, as he tied the bit of cloth to the barrel of his assault rifle. Telltales showed that half his pulse charge and ammunition remained. Fedman Kassad strode forward 5 paces, turned his back on the shrike, raised his arms to the people, still silent on the hillside, and shouted, "For liberty!" 3,000 voices cried back, "For liberty!" The roar did not end with the final word. Kassad turned, keeping the rifle and pennant high. The shrike moved forward half a step, opened its stance, and unfolded finger blades. Kassad shouted and attacked. Behind him, Moneta followed, weapon held high. Thousands followed. Later, in the carnage of the valley, Moneta and a few others of the chosen warriors found Kassad's body still wrapped in a death embrace with the battered shrike. They removed Kassad with care, carried him to a waiting tent in the valley, washed and tended to his ravaged body, and bore him through the multitudes to the crystal monolith. There the body of Colonel Fedman Kassad was laid on a bier of white marble, and weapons were set at his feet. In the valley, a great bonfire filled the air with light. All up and down the valley, men and women moved with torches, while other people descended through the lapis lazuli sky, some in flying craft as insubstantial as molded bubbles, others on wings of energy, or wrapped in circles of green and gold. Later, when the stars were in place, burning bright and cold above the light-filled valley, Moneta made her farewells and entered the Sphinx. The multitudes sang. In the fields beyond, small rodents poked among fallen pennants and the scattered remnants of carapace and armor, metal blade and melted steel. Toward midnight, the crowd stopped singing, gasped, and moved back. The time tombs glowed. Fierce tides of anti-entropic force drove the crowds farther back, to the entrance of the valley, across the battlefield, back to the great city, glowing softly in the night. In the valley, the great tombs shimmered, faded from gold to bronze, and started their long voyage back. Braun Lamia passed the glowing obelisk and struggled on against a wall of raging wind. Sand lacerated her skin and clawed at her eyes. Static lightning crackled on the cliff tops and added to the eerie glow surrounding the tombs. Braun spread her hands over her face and stumbled on, squinting between her fingers to find the trail. Braun saw a golden light deeper than the general glow flowing through the shattered panes of the crystal monolith and seeping out over the twisting dunes that were covering the valley floor. Someone was inside the monolith. Braun had vowed to go straight to the Shrike Palace, do whatever she could to free Silenus, and then return to Saul, not to be turned aside by diversions. But she had seen the silhouette of a human form inside the tomb. Cassad was still missing. Saul had told her of the consul's mission, but perhaps the diplomat had returned while the storm raged. Father Duray was unaccounted for. Braun came closer to the glow and paused at the jagged entrance to the monolith. The space inside was expansive and impressive, rising almost 100 meters to a half-sensed skylight roof. The walls, seen from within, were translucent, with what appeared to be sunlight turning them a rich gold and umber. The heavy light fell on the scene at the center of the wide area before her. Fedman Cassad lay on some sort of stone funeral bier. Think that's... I can't actually remember how that's pronounced. I think I've pronounced it two different ways now. Give me one sec. This is one of the exciting things about doing these live, is when you don't remember how a word is pronounced, sometimes you gotta figure it out. It is beer. Okay, very good. I was right the first time. At least that's the Amerikansky pronunciation. I can't read that. It is beer. Beer! Very good. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, it's a very fly-by-night operation, it is. Sorry about that, lads and lasses. Where were we? Fedman Cassad lay on some sort of stone funeral bier. He was clothed in force dress black, and his large, pale hands were crossed on his chest. Weapons, unknown to Braun except for Cassad's assault rifle, lay at his feet. The colonel's face was gaunt in death, but no more gaunt than it had been in life. His expression was calm. There was no question that he was dead. The silence of death hung about the place like incense. But it was the other person in the room who had shown the silhouette from afar, and who now commanded Braun's attention. A young woman in her mid to late 20s knelt by the bier. She wore a black jumpsuit, had short hair, fair skin, and large eyes. Braun remembered the soldier's story, told during their long trip to the valley, remembered the details of Kassad's phantom lover. "Moneta," whispered Braun. The young woman had been on one knee, her right hand extended to touch the stone next to the colonel's body. Violet containment fields flickered around the bier, and some other energy, a powerful vibration in the air, refracted light around Moneta as well, so that the scene was cast in haze and halo. The young woman raised her head, peered at Braun, rose to her feet, and nodded. Braun started to step forward, a score of questions already forming in her mind, but the time tides within the tomb were too powerful and drove her back with waves of vertigo and déjà vu. When Braun looked up, the bier remained. Kassad lay in state under his force field, but Moneta was gone. Braun had the urge to run back to the Sphinx, find Saul, tell him everything, and wait there until the storm abated and the morning came. But above the rasp and whine of wind, Braun thought that she could still hear the screams from the thorn tree, invisible behind its curtain of sand. Pulling her collar high, Braun walked back to the storm and turned up the trail toward the Shrike Palace. The mass of rock floated in space like a cartoon of a mountain, all jagged spires, knife-edge ridges, absurdly vertical faces, narrow ledges, broad rock balconies, and a snow-capped summit wide enough for only one person to stand there, and he or she only if both feet were together. The river twisted in from space, passed through the multi-layered containment field half a click out from the mountain, crossed a grassy swale on the widest of the rock balconies, and then plunged 100 meters or more in a slow-motion waterfall to the next terrace, then rebounding in artfully directed rivulets of spray to half a dozen minor streams and waterfalls which found their way down the face of the mountain. The tribunal held session on the highest terrace. 17 ousters, 6 males, 6 females, and 5 of indeterminate sex, sat within a stone circle set in the wider circle of rock-walled grass. Both circles held the consul as their locus. "You're aware," said Freeman Genga, the spokesman of the eligible citizens of the Freeman clan of the Transtoral Swarm. Transtoral. For some reason, that word looks very strange, but because there's no hyphen. Let's try that again. "You're aware," said Freeman Genga, the spokesman of the eligible citizens of the Freeman clan of the Transtoral Swarm, "that we are aware of your betrayal?" "Yes," said the consul. He had worn his finest dark blue bolo suit, maroon cape, and diplomat's tricorn cap. "Aware of the fact that you murdered Freeman Andil, Freeman Ilium, Cordwell Betts, and Mizenspesh Torrance." "I knew Andil's name," said the consul softly. "I wasn't introduced to the technicians." "But you murdered them?" "Yes." "Without provocation or warning?" "Yes." "Murdered them to take possession of the device which they had delivered to Hyperion, the machine which we told you would collapse the so-called time tides, open the time tombs, and release the Shrike from bondage?" "Yes." The consul's gaze appeared to be focused on something above Freeman Genga's shoulder, but far, far away. "We explained," said Genga, "that this device was to be used after we had successfully driven off the Hegemony ships, when our invasion and occupation was imminent, when the Shrike could be controlled." "Yes."
Yet you murdered our people, lied to us about it, and activated the device yourself years ahead of time.
Yes.
Emilio Arundez and Theo Lane were standing beside and a step behind the console, and their faces were grim. Freeman Genga folded her arms. She was a tall woman in the classic ouster mode. Bald, thin, draped in a regal dark blue flowsuit, which seemed to absorb light. Her face was old, but almost free of wrinkles. Her eyes were dark. Even though this was 4 of your standard years ago, did you think we would forget? Asked Genga. No. The consul lowered his gaze to meet hers. It appeared as if he almost smiled. Few cultures forget traitors, Freeman Genga. Yet you returned. The consul did not reply. Standing near him, Theo Lane felt a light breeze tug at his own formal tricorn. Theo felt as if he were still dreaming. The ride here had been surreal. 3 ousters had met them in a long, low gondola, floating easily on the calm waters below the consul's ship. With the 3 Hegemony visitors sitting amidships, the ouster at the stern had pushed off with a long pole, and the ship had floated back the way it had come, as if the current of the impossible river had reversed itself. Theo had actually closed his eyes as they approached the waterfall where the stream rose perpendicular to the surface of their asteroid, but when he opened his eyes a second later, down was still down, and the river seemed to be flowing along normally enough, even though the grassy sphere of the small world hung to one side like a great curved wall, and stars were visible through the 2-meter-thick ribbon of water beneath them. Then they were through the containment field, out of the atmosphere, and their velocity increased as they followed the twisting ribbon of water. There was a tube of containment sphere around them. Logic and the absence of their immediate and dramatic death dictated that there had to be, but it lacked the usual shimmer and optic texture that was so reassuring on Templar tree ships or the occasional tourist habitat open to space. Here there were only the river, the boat, the people, and the immensity of space.
They can't possibly use this as their form of transportation between swarm units,
Dr. Melio Arundez had said in a shaky voice. Theo had noted that Arundez also was gripping the gunwales with white fingers. Neither the ouster in the stern nor the 2 seated in the bow had communicated with anything more than a nod of confirmation when the consul had asked if this, then, was their promised transportation. They're showing off with the river, said consul. They're showing off with the river, said... Why am I doing that? They're showing off with the river, the consul had said softly. It's used when the swarm is at rest, but for ceremonial purposes. Deploying it while the swarm is moving is for effect. To impress us with their superior technology? Asked Theo, sotto voce. The consul nodded. The river had wound and twisted through space, sometimes almost doubling back on itself in huge, illogical loops, sometimes wrapping itself in tight spirals like a fiberplastic cord, always gleaming in sunlight from Hyperion's star and receding to infinity ahead of them. At times the river occluded the sun, and the colors then were magnificent. Theo gasped as he looked at the river loop 100 meters above them and saw fish silhouetted against the solar disk. But always the bottom of the boat was down, and they hurtled along at what must have been near cislunar transfer speeds, on a river unbroken by rocks or rapids. It was, as Arundez noted some minutes into their voyage, like driving one's canoe over the edge of an immense waterfall and trying to enjoy the ride on the way down. The river passed some of the elements of the swarm, which filled the sky like false stars. Massive comet farms, their dusty surfaces broken by the geometries of hard vacuum crops. Zero-G globe cities, great irregular spheres of transparent membrane looking like improbable amoebae, filled with busy flora and fauna. 10-click-long thrust clusters, accreted over centuries, their innermost modules and life cans and colleges looking like something stolen from O'Neill's boondoggle and the dawn of the space age. Wandering forests covering hundreds of kilometers, like immense floating kelp beds, connected to their thrust clusters and command nodes by containment fields and tangled skeins of roots and runners. The spherical tree forms weaving to gravity breezes and burning bright green and deep orange, and the 100 shades of old Earth autumn when ignited by direct sunlight. Hollowed out asteroids long since abandoned by their residents, now given over to automated manufacturing and heavy metal reprocessing, every centimeter of surface rock covered by pre-rusted structures, chimneys, and skeletal cooling towers, the glow of their internal fusion fires making each cinderish world look like Vulcan's forge. Immense spherical docking globes, given scale only by the torch ship and cruiser-sized warcraft flitting around their surfaces like spermatozoa attacking an egg. And, most indelible, organisms which the river came near or which flew near the river. Organisms which might have been manufactured or born, but probably were both. Great butterfly shapes, opening wings of energy to the sun. Insects which were spacecraft or vice versa, their antennae turning toward the river and gondola and its passengers as they passed. Multifaceted eyes gleaming in starlight. Smaller winged shapes, humans, entering and exiting and opening in a belly the size of a force attack carrier's dropship bay. And finally had come the mountain. An entire range of mountains, actually. Some blistered with 100 environment bubbles, some open to space but still heavily populated, some connected to others by suspension bridges 30 clicks long or tributary rivers, others regal in their solitude, many as empty and formal as a Zen garden. Then the final mountain, rising higher than Mons Olympus or Asquith's Mount Hillary, and the river's penultimate plunge toward its summit. Theo and the consul and Arundes, pale and silent, gripping the thwarts with quiet intensity as they plunged the final few kilometers with a suddenly perceptible and terrifying velocity. Finally, in the impossible last 100 meters as the river shed energy without deceleration, wider atmosphere surrounded them once again, and the boat floated to a halt in a grassy meadow where the Ouster clan tribunal stood, waiting, and stones rose in their circle of Stonehenge silence. "If they did this to impress me," Theo had whispered as the boat bumped the grassy shore, "they succeeded." "Why did you return to the swarm?" asked Freeman Genga. The woman paced, moving in the minuscule gravity with the grace common only to those born in space. "CEO Gladstone asked me to," said the consul. "And you came knowing that your own life would be forfeit?" The consul was too much the gentleman and diplomat to shrug, but his expression conveyed the same sentiment.
What does Gladstone want?
asked another ouster, the man who had been introduced by Genga as spokesman of the eligible citizens Cordwell Minmun. The consul repeated the CEO's 5 points. Spokesman Minmun folded his arms and looked at Freeman Genga. "I will answer now," said Genga. She looked at Arundes and Theo. "You two will listen carefully in the event that the man who brought these questions does not return to your ship with you." "Just a minute," said Theo, stepping forward to face the taller ouster. "Before passing judgment here, you have to take into account the fact that—" "Silence!" commanded spokesman Freeman Genga, but Theo had already been silenced by the consul's hand on his shoulder. "I will answer these questions now," repeated Genga. Far above her, a score of the small warships which Force had called Lancers flashed silently past, darting like a school of fish in 300G zigs and zags. Firstly, said Genga, Gladstone asks why we are attacking the web. She paused, looked at the other 16 ousters assembled there, and continued. We are not, except for this swarm attempting to occupy Hyperion before the time tombs opened. There are no swarms attacking the web. All three of the Hegemony men had stepped forward. Even the consul had lost his veneer of bemused calm and was all but stuttering in excitement. But that's not true. I saw the fat-lined images from the... Heaven's Gate is destroyed. God's Grove burned. Silence! Commanded Freeman Genga. Into that silence she said, Only this swarm is doing battle with the Hegemony. Our sister swarms are where the long-range web detectors had first placed them, moving away from the web, fleeing from further provocations, such as Brescia's attacks. The consul rubbed at his face like a man awakening. But then who... Precisely, said Freeman Genga. Who would have the ability to carry out such a charade? And the motive to slaughter humans by the billion? The core? Breathed the consul. The mountain was slowly rotating, and at this moment they turned into night. A convection breeze moved across the mountain terrace, rustling the ouster's robes and the consul's cape. Overhead, the stars seemed to explode into brilliance. The great rocks of the Stonehenge circle seemed to glow from some internal warmth. Theo Lane stood next to the consul, fearing that the man might collapse. We have only your word on this, Theo said to the ouster spokesman. It makes no sense. Genga did not blink. We will show you proof. Void which binds transmission locators. Real-time star field images from our sister swarms. Void which binds? Said Arundez. His usually calm voice showed agitation. What you call the fat line. Spokesman Freeman Genga paced to the nearest stone and ran her hand across its rough surface as if taking warmth from the heat within. Starfields pirouetted above. To answer Gladstone's second question, she said, we do not know where the core resides. We have fled it and fought it and sought it and feared it for centuries, but we have not found it. You must tell us the answer to that question. We have declared war on this parasite entity you call the TechnoCore. The consul seemed to sag. We have no idea. Authorities in the web have sought the core since before the Hegera, but it is as elusive as El Dorado. We found no hidden worlds, no massive asteroids crammed with hardware, and no hint of it on web worlds. He gestured tiredly with his left hand. For all we know, you are hiding the core in one of your swarms. We are not, said spokesman Cordwell Minmun. The consul did shrug at last. The Hegera bypassed thousands of worlds in its grand survey. Anything that didn't score at least 9.7 on their 10-point terabase scale was ignored. The core could be anywhere along those early lines of flight and exploration. We'll never find it. And if we do, it'll be years after the web is destroyed. You were our last hope for locating it. Genga shook her head. Far above them, the summit caught the light of sunrise while the Terminator moved down the ice fields toward them with almost alarming rapidity. Thirdly, Gladstone asked for our demands for a ceasefire. Except for the swarm in this system, we are not the ones attacking. We will accept a ceasefire as soon as Hyperion is under our control, which should be momentarily. We have just been informed that our expeditionary forces have control of the capital and its spaceport. The hell you say? The hell you say? Said Theo, hands curling into fists despite himself. The hell we do say, agreed Freeman Genga. Tell Gladstone that we will now join you in a common fight against the TechnoCore. She glanced toward the silent members of the tribunal. Since we are many years' travel from the web, however, and we do not trust your core-controlled Farcasters, our help must necessarily come in the form of retaliating for the destruction of your hegemony. You will be avenged. That's reassuring, said the consul dryly. Fourthly, Gladstone asks if we will meet with her. The answer is yes. If she is, as she says she is, willing to come to Hyperion system, we have preserved the Force Farcaster for just that eventuality. We will not travel by Farcaster. Why not? Asked Arundez. A third ouster, not introduced, one of the furred and beautifully altered type, spoke.
The device you call a Farcaster is an abomination, a defilement of the void which binds.
Ah, religious reasons, said the consul, nodding in understanding. The exotically striped and furred ouster shook his head adamantly.
No, the Farcaster web is the yoke on humankind's neck, the contract of subservience which has bound you to stagnation. We will have none of it.
Fifthly, said Freeman Genga, Gladstone's mention of the Death Wand explosive device is nothing but a crude ultimatum. But as we have said, it is aimed at the wrong opponent. The forces sweeping into your frail and fading web are not of the clans of the 12 sister swarms. We have only your word on that, said the consul. His gaze, now locked with Genga's, was firm and defiant. You have my word on nothing, said spokesman Genga. Clan elders do not give their word to core slaves, but this is the truth. The consul seemed distracted as he half turned toward Theo. We have to get this word to Gladstone immediately. He turned back to Genga. May my friends return to the ship to communicate your response, spokesman? Genga nodded and gestured for the gondola to be made ready. We're not going back without you, Theo said to the consul, stepping between him and the closest ousters as if to protect the older man with his own body. Yes, said the consul, touching Theo's upper right arm. You are. You must. He's right, said Arundez, pulling Theo away before the young Governor-General can speak again. This is too important to risk not communicating. You go. I'll stay with him. Genga gestured toward two of the more massive exotic ousters. You will return with the to the ship. The consul will remain. The tribunal has not yet decided his fate. Arundez and Theo both wheeled with fists raised, but the furred ousters seized them and moved them away with the restrained effort of adults handling small but unruly children. The consul watched them set in place in the gondola, and he stifled the urge to wave as the boat moved 20 meters down the placid stream, dipped out of sight beyond the curve of the terrace, and then reappeared, climbing the waterfall toward black space. It was lost to sight within minutes in the glare of the sun. He turned slowly in a full circle, making eye contact with each of the 17 ousters. Let's get it over with, said the consul. I've waited a long time for this. Saul Weintraub sat between the great paws of the Sphinx and watched the storm abate, wind dying from scream to sigh to whisper, curtains of dust diminishing and then parting to show the stars, and finally the long night settling into a dreadful calm. The tombs glowed more brightly than before, but nothing came out of the blazing doorway of the Sphinx, and Saul could not enter. The push of blinding light was like 1,000 irresistible fingers against his chest, and lean and strain as he might, Saul could get no closer than 3 meters from the doorway. Whatever stood or moved or waited inside was lost to sight in the glare of light. Saul sat and held on to the stone stair as time tides pulled at him, tugged at him, and made him weep in the false shock of déjà vu. The entire Sphinx seemed to rock and pitch in the violent storm of expanding and contracting anti-entropic fields. Rachel. Saul would not leave while there was any chance his daughter might be alive. Lying on cold stone, listening to the wind scream die, Saul saw the cold stars appear, saw the meteor trail and laser lance thrust and counterthrust of orbital war, knew in his heart that the war was lost, that the web was in danger, that great empires were falling as he watched, the human race might be hanging in the balance this endless night. And he did not care. Saul Weintraub cared about his daughter. And even as he lay there, cold, buffeted by winds and time tides, bruised with fatigue and hollow from hunger, Saul felt a certain peace descend on him. He had given his daughter to a monster, but not because God had commanded him to, not because fate or fear had willed it, but only because his daughter had appeared to him in a dream and told him that it was all right, that this was the thing to do, that their love, his and Sarai's and Rachel's, demanded it. In the end, thought Saul, past logic and hope, it is dreams and the love of those dearest to us that form Abraham's answer to God. Saul's comm log no longer worked. It might have been an hour or 5 hours since he had handed his dying infant to the Shrike. Saul lay back, still gripping stone, as the time tides made the Sphinx bob like a small ship on a big sea, and stared at the stars and battle above. Sparks drifted across the sky, glowed bright as supernovae as laser lances found them, and then fell in a shower of molten debris, white hot to red to blue flame to darkness. Saul imagined dropships burning, imagined ouster troops and Hegemony marines dying in a scream of atmosphere and melting titanium. He tried to imagine this, and failed. Saul realized that space battles and the movements of fleets and the fall of empires were beyond his imagining, hidden from the reservoirs of his sympathy or understanding. Such things belonged to Such things belonged to Thucydides and Tacitus and Caton and Wu. Saul had met his senator from Barnard's world, had met with her several times in his and Sarai's quest to save Rachel from Merlin's sickness, but Saul could not imagine Feldstein's participation on the scale of interstellar war, or in anything much larger than dedicating a new medical center in the capital of Bussard, or pressing the flesh during a rally at the university in Crawford. Saul had never met the current Hegemony CEO, but as a scholar he had enjoyed her subtle replay of the speeches of such classical figures as Churchill and Lincoln and Alvarez Tump. But now, lying between the paws of a great stone beast and weeping for his daughter, Saul could not imagine what was in that woman's mind as she made decisions that would save or damn billions, preserve or betray the greatest empire in human history. Saul didn't give a damn. He wanted his daughter back. He wanted Rachel to be alive despite all logic to the contrary. Lying between the Sphinx's stone paws on a besieged world in a ravaged empire, Saul Weintraub wiped tears from his eyes, the better to see the stars, and thought of Yeats's poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. Once more the storm is howling, and half hid under this cradle hood and cover lid, my child sleeps on. There is no obstacle but Gregory's Wood and one bare hill, whereby the haystack and roof-leveling wind, bred on the Atlantic, can be stayed. And for an hour I have walked and prayed, because of the great gloom that is in my mind. I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower, and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream, imagining in excited reverie that the future years had come, dancing to a frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea. All Saul wanted, he realized now, was the same possibility once again to worry about those future years which every parent fears and dreads. To not allow her childhood and teenage years and awkward young adulthood to be stolen and destroyed by the sickness. Saul had spent his life willing the return of things unreturnable. He remembered the day he had come upon Sarai folding Rachel's toddler clothes and setting them in a box in the attic, and he recalled her tears and his own sense of loss for the child they still had but that for the oh, sorry. And he recalled her tears and his own sense of loss for the child they still had, but who was lost to them through the simple arrow of time. Saul knew now that little could be returned except by memory, that Sarai was dead and beyond ability to return, that Rachel's childhood friends and world were gone forever, that even the society he had left only a few weeks of his time ago was in the process of being lost beyond return. And thinking of that, lying between the taloned paws of the Sphinx as the wind died and the false stars burned, Saul is reminded of part of a different and far more ominous poem by Yeats. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Saul does not know. Saul discovers again that he does not care. Saul wants his daughter back. The consensus in the War Council seemed to be to drop the bomb. Mina Gladstone sat at the head of the long table and felt the peculiar and not unpleasant sense of separateness which comes from far too little sleep over far too long a period. To close her eyes, even for a second, meant sliding on the black ice of fatigue, so she did not close her eyes, even when they burned and when the drone of briefings, conversation, and urgent debate faded and receded through thick curtains of exhaustion. Together, the Council had watched as the embers of Task Force 181.2, Commander Lee's attack group, had winked out one by one until only a dozen of the original 74 were left still driving toward the center of the approaching swarm. Lee's cruiser was among the survivors. During this silent attrition, this abstract and oddly attractive representation of violent and all too real death, Admiral Singh and General Morpurgo had completed their gloomy assessment of the war.
Force and the new Bushido were designed for limited conflicts, minor skirmishes, prescribed limits, and modest aims, summarized Morpurgo. With less than 500,000 men and women under arms, Force would not be comparable to the armies of one of the old Earth nation-states 1,000 years ago. The swarm can swamp us with sheer numbers, outgun our fleets, and win through arithmetic.
Senator Kolchev glowered from his place at the opposite end of the table. The Lucian had been much more active in the briefing and debate than Gladstone. Questions were turned his way more frequently than to her. Almost as if everyone in the room were subliminally aware that power was shifting, the torch of leadership was being passed. Not yet, thought Gladstone, tapping her chin with steepled fingers and listening to Kolchev cross-examine the general.
Of falling back and defending essential worlds on the second wave list, Tau Centi Center, of course, but also necessary industrial worlds such as Renaissance Minor, Fuji, Deneb-Vir, and Lucis.
General Morpurgo looked down and shuffled papers as if to hide the sudden flash of anger in his eyes.
Senator, less than 10 standard days remain until the second wave completes its target list. Renaissance Minor will fall under attack within 90 hours. What I am saying is that with the current size, structure, and technology available to Force, it would be doubtful if we could hold one system, say TC squareds.
Senator Kakanuma rose.
This is not acceptable, General.
Morpurgo looked up.
I agree, Senator, but it is true.
President Pro Tem Denzel Hyatt Amin sat, shaking his gray and mottled head.
It makes no sense. Were there no plans to defend the web?
Admiral Singh spoke from his seat.
The best estimates of the threat told us that we would have a minimum of 18 months should the swarms ever turn toward the attack.
Minister of Diplomacy Persov cleared his throat.
And if we were to concede these 25 worlds to the ousters, Admiral, how long until the first or second wave could attack other web worlds?
Singh did not have to refer to his notes or comlog.
Depending upon their target Embersov, the nearest web world, Esperance, would be 9 standard months away from the closest swarm. The most distant target, home system, would be some 14 years by Hawking Drive.
Time enough to shift to a war economy,
said Senator Feldstein. Her constituency on Barnard's World had less than 40 standard hours to live. Feldstein had vowed to be with them when the end came. Her voice was precise and passionless.
It makes sense. Cut your losses. Even with TC squared and 24 more worlds lost, the web can produce incredible quantities of war materiel, even in 9 months. Within the years it will take for the ousters to penetrate farther into the web, we should be able to beat them through sheer industrial mass.
Defense Minister Imoto shook his head.
There are irreplaceable raw materials being lost in this first and second wave. The disruption to web economy will be staggering.
Do we have a choice? Asked Senator Peters from Deneb-Dry. All eyes turned toward the person sitting next to AI Counselor Albedo. As if to underline the importance of the moment, a new AI persona had been admitted to the War Council and had given the presentation on the awkwardly labeled Death Wand device. Counselor Nansen was tall, male, tanned, relaxed, impressive, convincing, trustworthy, and imbued with that rare charisma of leadership that made one both like and respect the person on sight. Mina Gladstone feared and loathed the new counselor at once. She felt as if this projection had been designed by AI experts to create just the response of trust and obedience she sensed others at the table already granting. And Nansen's message, she feared, meant death. The Death Wand had been web technology for centuries, designed by the Corps and limited to force personnel and a few specialized security forces such as government houses and Gladstone's Praetorians. It did not burn, blast, shoot, slag, or incinerate. It made no sound and projected no visible ray or sonic footprint. It simply made the target die. If the target were human, that is. A Death Wand's range was limited, no more than 50 meters, but within that range, a targeted human died, while other animals and property were totally safe. Autopsies showed scrambled synapses, but no other damage. Death Wands merely made one cease to be. Force officers had carried them as short-range personal weapons and symbols of authority for generations. Now, Counselor Nansen revealed, the Corps had perfected a device that utilized the Death Wand principle on a larger scale. They had hesitated to reveal its existence, but with the imminent and terrible threat of the Ouster invasion... The questioning had been energetic and sometimes cynical, with the military more skeptical than the politicians. Yes, the Death Wand device could rid us of the Ousters, but what about the Hegemony population? Remove them to shelter on one of the labyrinthine worlds, Nansen had replied, repeating the earlier plan of Counselor Albedo. 5 kilometers of rock would shield them from any effects of the widening Death Wand ripples. How far did these death rays propagate? Their effect diminished to below the lethal level at just under 3 light-years, Nansen responded calmly, confidently, the ultimate salesman in the penultimate sales pitch. The ultimate salesman in the penultimate sales pitch. A wide enough radius to rid any system of the attacking swarm. Small enough to protect all but the nearest neighboring star systems. 92% of the web worlds had no other inhabited world within 5 light-years. And what about those who can't be evacuated? Morpurgo had demanded. Counselor Nansen had smiled and opened his palm as if to show there was nothing hidden there. Do not activate the device until your authorities are sure that all Hegemony citizens are evacuated or shielded, he had said. It will be, after all, totally under your control. Feldstein, Sabenstorapham, Peters, Persov, and many of the others had been instantly enthusiastic. A secret weapon to end all secret weapons. The Ousters could be warned. A demonstration could be arranged. I'm sorry, Counselor Nansen had said. His teeth, when he smiled, were as pearly white as his robes. There can be no demonstration. The weapon works just as a Death Wand, only across a much wider region. There will be no property damage or blast effect, no measurable shock wave above the neutrino level. Merely dead invaders. To demonstrate it, Counselor Albedo had explained, you must use it on at least one Ouster swarm. The excitement of the War Council had not been lessened. Perfect, said All Things Speaker Gibbons. Choose one swarm, test the device, fatline the results to the other swarms, and give them a 1-hour deadline to break off their attacks. We didn't provoke this war. Better millions of the enemy dead than a war that claims tens of billions over the next decade. Hiroshima, Gladstone had said, her only comment of the day. It had been said too softly for anyone except her aide Sedeptra to hear. Morpurgo had asked, do we know that the killing rays will become ineffective at 3 light-years? Have you tested it? Counselor Nansen smiled. If he answered yes, there were heaps of dead humans somewhere. If he said no, the device's reliability was seriously at stake. We are certain it will work, said Nansen. Our simulation runs were foolproof.
The Kiev team AI said that about the first Farcaster singularity, thought Gladstone, the one that destroyed Earth.
She said nothing aloud. Still, Singh and Morpurgo and Van Zeit and their specialists had spiked Nansen's guns by showing that Mare Infinitus could not be evacuated quickly enough, and that and that the only first-wave web world that had its own labyrinth was Armagast, which was within a light-year of Pachem and Svoboda. Counselor Nansen's earnest, helpful smile did not fade.
You want a demonstration, and that would be only sensible, he said quietly. You need to show the ousters that invasion will not be tolerated, while focusing on the minimum loss of life. And you need to shelter your indigenous hegemony population.
He paused, folded his hands on the tabletop.
What about Hyperion?
The buzz around the table deepened in tone.
It's not really a web world,
said Speaker Gibbons.
Yet it is in the web now, with the Force Farcasters still in... Yes, yet it is in the web now, with the Force Farcasters still in place.
Oh, sorry, that's a...
Yet it is in the web now, with the Force Farcasters still in place.
There we go, cried Garion Persov of diplomacy, obviously a convert to the idea. General Morpurgo's stern expression did not shift.
That will be there only another few hours. We're protecting the singularity sphere now, but it could fall at any time. Much of Hyperion itself is already in ouster hands.
But Hegemony personnel have been evacuated?
Said Persov.
Singh answered. All but the Governor-General. He could not be found in the confusion.
A pity,
said Minister Persov without much conviction.
But the point is that the remaining population is mostly Hyperion indigene, with easy access to the labyrinth there, correct?
Barbara Dan Giddis of the Ministry of Economy, whose son had been a fiberplastic plantation manager near Port Romance, said, I just lost my place, I'm sorry. Oh, that's embarrassing.
Within 3 hours? Impossible.
Nansen stood.
I think not, he said. We can fatline the warning to the remaining Home Rule authorities in the capital, and they can begin the evacuation immediately. There are thousands of entrances to the labyrinth on Hyperion. The capital of Keats is under siege, growled Morpurgo. The entire planet is under attack.
Counselor Nansen nodded sadly.
And soon it will be put to the sword by the barbarian ousters. A difficult choice, gentlemen and ladies. But the device will work. The invasion will simply cease to exist in Hyperion space. Millions might be saved on the planet, and the effect on the ouster invasion forces elsewhere would be significant. We know that their so-called sister swarms communicate by fatline. The termination of the first swarm to invade hegemony space, the Hyperion swarm, may be the perfect deterrent.
Nansen shook his head again and looked around with an expression of almost paternal concern. There could be no simulating such pained sincerity.
It has to be your decision. The weapon is yours to use or disregard. It pains the core to take any human life, or, through inaction, allow any human life to come to harm. But in this case, where the lives of billions are at risk,
Nansen opened his hands again, shook his head a final time, and sat back, obviously leaving the decision to human minds and hearts. Babble around the long table rose. Debate grew almost violent.
CEO!
Called General Morpurgo. In the sudden silence, Gladstone lifted her gaze to the holographic displays in the darkness above them. The Mare Infinitus swarm fell toward that ocean world like a torrent of blood aimed toward a small blue sphere. Only 3 of the orange Task Force 181.2 embers remained, and even as the silent council watched, 2 of these winked out. Then the final one was extinguished. Gladstone whispered into her comlog.
Communications. Any last message from Admiral Lee?
None to the command center, CEO, came the response. Only standard fat line telemetry during the battle. It appears they did not reach the center of the swarm.
Gladstone and Lee had held hopes of capturing ousters, of interrogations, of establishing the identity of their enemy beyond a doubt. Now that young man of such energy and ability was dead. Dead at Mina Gladstone's command, and 74 ships of the line were wasted.
Mare Infinitus Farcaster destroyed by preset plasma explosives, reported Admiral Singh. Forward elements of the swarm now entering cislunar defense perimeter.
No one spoke. The holographics showed the tidal wave of blood-red lights engulfing the Mare Infinitus system, the final orange embers around that gold world blinking out. A few hundred of the ouster ships remained in orbit, presumably reducing Mare Infinitus's elegant floating cities and ocean farms to burning debris, but the major part of the blood tide rolled on, out of the region projected above.
Asquith system in 3 standard hours, 41 minutes, intoned a technician near the display board.
Senator Kolchev stood.
Let's put the Hyperion demonstration to a vote,
he said, ostensibly addressing Gladstone, but speaking to the crowd. Mina Gladstone tapped her lower lip.
No, she said at last. No vote. We will use the device. Admiral, prepare the torch ship armed with the device to translate to Hyperion space and then broadcast warnings to planet and ouster alike. Give them 3 hours. Minister Emoto, send coded fatline signals to Hyperion telling them that they must, repeat, must, seek shelter in the labyrinths at once. Tell them that a new weapon is being tested.
Morpurgo wiped sweat from his face.
CEO, we can't run any risk that this device can fall into enemy hands.
Gladstone looked at Councillor Nansen and tried to make her expression reveal nothing of what she felt.
Counselor, can this device be rigged so that it detonates automatically if our ship is captured or destroyed?
Yes, CEO.
Do it. Explain all necessary fail-safe devices to the proper force experts. She turned toward Sedeptra. Prepare a web-wide broadcast for me, scheduled to commence 10 minutes before the device is to be detonated. I have to tell our people about this.
Is that wise?
Began Senator Feldstein. It is necessary, said Gladstone.
She rose, and the 38 people in the room rose a second later.
I'm going to get a few minutes' sleep while you people work. I want the device ready and in system and Hyperion warned immediately. I want contingency plans and priorities for a negotiated settlement ready by the time I awaken in 30 minutes.
Gladstone looked out at the group, knowing that one way or the other, most of the people there would be out of power and out of office within the next 20 hours. One way or the other, it was her last day as CEO. Mina Gladstone smiled.
Council dismissed,
she said, and Farcast to her private quarters to take a nap.
Chapter 43. Leigh Hunt had never seen anyone die before. The last day and night he spent with Keats, Hunt still thought of him as Joseph Severn, but was sure that the dying man now thought of himself as John Keats, were the most difficult in Hunt's life. The hemorrhages came frequently during Keats's last day of life, and between these bouts of retching, Hunt could hear the phlegm boiling in the small man's throat and chest as he fought for life. Hunt sat next to the bed in the small front room in the Piazza di Spagna and listened to Keats babble as sunrise moved to mid-morning and mid-morning faded to early afternoon.
Keats was feverish and moving in and out of consciousness, but he insisted that Hunt listen and write everything down. They had found ink, pen, and foolscap in the other room, and Hunt complied, scribbling furiously as the dying Cybrid raved on about metaspheres and lost divinities, the responsibilities of poets and the passing of gods, and the Miltonic civil war in the core. Hunt had perked up then and squeezed Keats's feverish hand.
Where is the core, Keats? Where is it?
The dying man had broken into a visible sweat and turned his face away.
Don't breathe on me. It comes like ice.
The core,
repeated Hunt, leaning back, feeling close to tears from pity and frustration.
Where is the core?
Keats smiled, his head moving back and forth in pain. The effort he made to breathe sounded like wind through a ruptured bellows.
Like spiders in the web, he muttered. Spiders in the web, weaving, letting us weave it for them, then trussing us and draining us like flies caught by spiders in the web.
Hunt quit writing as he listened to more of this seemingly senseless babble. Then he understood.
My God, he whispered, they're in the Farcaster system.
Keats tried to sit up, grasped Hunt's arm with a terrible strength.
Tell your leader, Hunt. Have Gladstone rip it out. Rip it out! Spiders in the web, man-god and machine-god must find the union. Not me.
He dropped back on the pillows and started weeping without sound.
Not me.
Keats slept some through the long afternoon, although Hunt knew that it was something closer to death than sleep. The slightest sound would start the dying poet awake and set him wrestling to breathe. By sunset, Keats was too weak to expectorate, and Hunt had to help him lower his head over the basin to allow gravity to clear his mouth and throat of bloody mucus. Several times, when Keats fell into fitful naps, Hunt walked to the window and once down the stairs to the front door to stare into the piazza. Something tall and sharp-edged stood in the deepest shadows opposite the piazza, near the base of the steps. In the evening, Hunt himself dozed off while sitting upright in the hard chair next to Keats's bed. He awoke from a dream of falling and put his hand out to steady himself, only to find Keats awake and staring at him.
Did you ever see anyone die?
Asked Keats between soft gasps for breath.
No.
Hunt thought that there was something odd about the young man's gaze, as if Keats were looking at him but seeing someone else.
Well, then, I pity you, said Keats. What trouble and danger you have got into for me. Now you must be firm, for it will not last long.
Hunt was struck not only by the gentle courage in that remark, but by the sudden shift in Keats's dialect from flat web standard English to something much older and more interesting.
Nonsense,
said Hunt heartily, forcing enthusiasm and energy he did not feel.
We'll be out of this before dawn. I'm going to sneak out as soon as it gets dark and find a Farcaster portal.
Keats shook his head.
The Shrike will take you. It will allow no one to help me. Its role is to see that I must escape myself through myself.
He closed his eyes as his breathing grew more ragged.
I don't understand,
said Leigh Hunt, taking the young man's hand. He assumed this was more of the fever talking, but since it was one of the few times Keats had been fully conscious in the past 2 days, Hunt felt it worth the effort to communicate.
What do you mean, escape yourself through yourself?
Keats's eyes fluttered open. They were hazel and far too bright.
Ummon and the others are trying to make me escape myself through accepting the godhood, Hunt. Bait to catch the white whale, honey to catch the ultimate fly. Fleeing empathy shall find its home in me, Mr. John Keats, 5 feet high. And then the reconciliation begins, right?
What reconciliation?
Hunt leaned closer, trying not to breathe on him. Keats appeared to have shrunk in his bedclothes, tangle of blankets, but heat radiating from him seemed to fill the room. His face was a pale oval in the dying light. Hunt was only faintly aware of a gold band of reflected sunlight moving across the wall just below where it met the ceiling, but Keats's eyes never left that last smear of day.
The reconciliation of man and machine, creator and created,
Said Keats, and began to cough, stopping only after he had drooled red phlegm into the basin Hunt held for him. He lay back, gasped a moment, and added,
reconciliation of humankind and those races it tried to exterminate, the core and the humanity it tried to expunge, the painfully evolved god of the void which binds, and its ancestors who tried to expunge it.
Hunt shook his head and quit writing.
I don't understand. You can become this Messiah by leaving your deathbed?
The pale oval of Keats's face moved back and forth on the pillow in a motion which might have been a substitute for laughter.
We all could have, Hunt, mankind's folly and greatest pride. We accept our pain. We make way for our children. That earned us the right to become the God we dreamed of.
Hunt looked down and found his own fist clenched in frustration.
If you can do this, become this power, then do it. Get us out of here.
Keats closed his eyes again.
Can't. I'm not the one who comes, but the one who comes before. Not the baptized, but the Baptist. Merde, Hunt, I'm an atheist. Even Seven couldn't convince me of these things when I was drowning in death.
Keats gripped Hunt's shirt with a fierceness that frightened the older man.
Write this.
And Hunt fumbled to find the ancient pen and rough paper, scribbling furiously to catch the words Keats now whispered.
A wondrous lesson in thy silent face. Knowledge enormous makes a god of me. Names, deeds, grey legends, dire events, rebellions, majesties, sovereign voices, agonies, creations and destroyings all at once. Pour into the wide hollows of my brain, and deify me as if some blithe wine or bright elixir peerless I had drunk, and so become immortal.
Keats lived for 3 more painful hours, a swimmer rising occasionally from his sea of agony to take a breath or whisper some urgent nonsense. Once, long after dark, he pulled at Hunt's sleeve and whispered sensibly enough,
When I am dead, the shrike will not harm you. It waits for me. There may not be a way home, but it will not harm you while you search.
And again, just as Hunt was bending over to hear if the breath still gurgled in the poet's lungs, Keats began to talk and continued between spasms until he had given Hunt specific instructions for his entombment in Rome's Protestant cemetery near the pyramid of Caius Cestius.
Nonsense, nonsense,
Hunt muttered over and over like a mantra, squeezing the young man's hot hand.
Flowers,
whispered Keats a little later, just after Hunt had lighted a lamp on the bureau. The poet's eyes were wide as he stared at the ceiling in a look of pure, childish wonder. Hunt glanced upward and saw the faded yellow roses painted in blue squares on the ceiling.
flowers, above me,
whispered Keats between his efforts to breathe. Hunt was standing at the window, staring out at the shadows beyond the Spanish Steps, when the painful rasp of breath behind him faltered and stopped, and Keats gasped out,
Seven, lift me up. I am dying.
Hunt sat on the bed and held him. Heat flowed from the small body that seemed to weigh nothing, as if the actual substance of the man had been burned away.
Don't be frightened. Be firm. And thank God it has come,
gasped Keats, and then the terrible rasping subsided. Hunt helped Keats lie back more comfortably as his breathing eased into a more normal rhythm. Hunt changed the water in the basin, moistened a fresh cloth, and came back to find Keats dead. Later, just after the sun rose, Hunt lifted the small body, wrapped in fresh linens from Hunt's own bed, and went out into the city. The storm had the storm had abated by the time Braun Lamia had reached the end of the valley. As she passed the cave tombs, she had seen the same eerie glow the other tombs were emitting, but there also came a terrible noise, as if of thousands of souls crying out, echoing and moaning from the earth. Braun hurried on. The sky was clear by the time she stood in front of the Shrike Palace. The structure was aptly named. The half dome arched up and outward like the creature's carapace. Support elements curved downward like blades stabbing the valley floor, and other buttresses leaped upward and away like shrike thorns. Walls had become translucent as the interior glow increased, and now the building shone like a giant jack-o'-lantern shaved paper thin. The upper regions glowed red as the shrike's gaze. Braun took a breath and touched her abdomen. She was pregnant. She had known it before she left Lucis. And didn't she owe more now to her unborn son or daughter than to the obscene old poet on the shrike's tree? Braun knew that the answer was yes, and that it did not matter one damn bit. She let out the breath and approached the Shrike Palace. From the outside, the Shrike Palace was no more than 20 meters across. Before, when they had entered, Braun and the other pilgrims had seen the interior as a single open space, empty except for the blade-like supports that crisscrossed the space under the glowing dome. Now, as Braun stood at the entrance, the interior was a space larger than the valley itself. A dozen tiers of white stone rose rank on rank and stretched into the faded distance. On each tier of stone human bodies lay, each garbed a different way, each tethered by the same sort of semi-organic, semi-parasitic shunt socket and cable which her friends had told Braun she herself had worn. Only these metallic but translucent umbilicals pulsed red. Only these metallic but translucent umbilicals pulsed red and expanded and contracted regularly, as if blood were being recycled through the sleeping forms' skulls. Sorry about that. Braun staggered back, affected by the pull of anti-entropic tides as by the view. Affected by the pull of anti-entropic tides as much as by the view, but when she stood 10 meters from the palace, the exterior was the same size as always. She did not pretend to understand how cliques of interior could fit into such a modest shell. The time tombs were opening. This one could coexist in different times, for all she knew. What she did understand was that when she was awakening from her own travels under the shunt, she had seen the Shrike's thorn tree tied with tubes and vines of energy invisible to the eye, but now quite obviously connected with the Shrike Palace. She stepped to the entrance again. The Shrike waited inside. Its carapace, usually gleaming, now seemed black, silhouetted against the light and marble glare around it. Braun felt the adrenaline rush fill her, felt the impulse to turn and run. and stepped inside. The entrance all but vanished behind her, remaining visible only by a faint fuzziness in the uniform glow which emanated from the walls. The Shrike did not move. Its red eyes gleamed from the shadow of its skull. Braun stepped forward, her booted heels making no sound on the stone floor. The Shrike was 10 meters to her right where the stone biers began, ascending like obscene display racks to a ceiling lost in the glow. She had no illusion that she could make it back to the door before the creature closed on her. It did not move. The air smelled of ozone and something sickly sweet. Braun moved along the wall at her back and scanned the rows of bodies for a familiar sleeping face. With each step to her left, she moved farther from the exit and made it easier for the Shrike to cut her off. The creature stood there like a black sculpture in an ocean of light. The tiers did stretch for kilometers. Stone steps, each almost a meter high, broke the horizontal lines of dark bodies. Several minutes' walk from the entrance, Braun climbed the lower third of one of these stairways, touched the nearest body on the second tier, and was relieved to find the flesh warm, the man's chest rising and falling. It was not Martin Silenus. Braun continued onward, half expecting to find Paul de Rey or Saul Weintraub or even herself lying among the living dead. Instead, she found a face she had last seen carved into a mountainside. Sad King Billy lay motionless on white stone, 5 tiers up, his royal robes scorched and stained. The sad face was, as were all the others, contorted in some internal agony. Martin Silenus lay 3 bodies away on a lower tier. Braun crouched next to the poet, glancing over her shoulder at the black speck of the Shrike, still unmoving at the end of the rows of bodies. Like the others, Silenus appeared to be alive, in silent agony, and was attached by a shunt socket connected to a pulsating umbilical which, in turn, ran into the white wall behind the ledge as if wed to the stone. Braun panted from fear as she ran her hand over the poet's skull, feeling the fusion of plastic and bone, and then felt along the umbilical itself, finding no join or opening to the point where it melded with stone. Fluid pulsed beneath her fingers. "Shit!" whispered Braun, and, in a sudden flurry of panic, looked behind her, certain the Shrike had crept within striking distance. The dark form still stood at the end of the long room. Her pockets were empty. She had neither weapon nor tool. She realized that she would have to return to the Sphinx, find the packs, dig out something to cut with, and then return and muster enough courage to enter here again. Braun knew that she could never come through that door again. She knelt, took a deep breath, and brought her hand and arm up, then down. The edge of her palm smashed against material that looked like clear plastic and felt harder than steel. Her arm ached from wrist to shoulder from the single blow. Braun Lamia glanced to her right. The Shrike was moving toward her, stepping slowly like an old man out for a leisurely walk. Braun shouted, knelt, and struck again, palm edge rigid, thumb locked at right angles. The long room echoed to the impact. Braun Lamia had grown up on Lucis at 1.3 standard gravity, and she was athletic for her race. Since she was 9 years old, she had dreamed of and worked toward becoming a detective, and a part of that admittedly obsessive and totally illogical preparation had been training in the martial arts. Now she grunted, raised her arm, and struck again, willing her palm to be an axe blade, seeing in her mind the severing blow, the successful strike-through. The tough umbilical dented imperceptibly, pulsed like a living thing, and seemed to cringe away as she swung again. Footsteps became audible below and behind her. Braun almost giggled. The Shrike could move without walking, go from here to there without the effort of going between. It must enjoy scaring its prey. Brawn was not frightened. She was too busy. She raised her hand, brought it down again. It would have been easier striking the stone for effect. She slammed her palm edge into the umbilical again, feeling some small bone give in her hand. The pain was like a distant noise, like the sliding below her and behind her. Has it occurred to you, she thought, that it'll probably kill him if you do manage to break this thing? She swung again. The footsteps stopped at the base of the stairway below. Braun was panting from the effort. Sweat dripped from her forehead and cheeks onto the chest of the sleeping poet. I don't even like you, she thought at Martin Silenus, and chopped again. It was like trying to sever a metal elephant's leg. The Shrike began ascending the staircase. Braun half stood and threw the entire weight of her body into a swing which almost dislocated her shoulder and broke her wrist, and smashed small bones in her hand. And severed the umbilical. Red fluid, too non-viscous for blood, splashed across Braun's leg and the white stone. The severed cable, still extending from the wall, spasmed and then thrashed like an agitated tentacle, before lying limply and then withdrawing, a bleeding snake sliding into a hole that ceased to exist as soon as the umbilical was out of sight. The stump of umbilical still attached to Silenus's neural shunt socket withered in 5 seconds, drying and contracting like a jellyfish out of water. Red splashed the poet's face and shoulders, the liquid turning blue even as Braun watched. Martin Silenus's eyes twitched and opened like an owl's.
Hey, he said, do you know the fucking Shrike's standing right behind you?
Gladstone cast to her private apartments and went at once to her fatline cubicle. 2 messages waited. The first was from Hyperion space. Gladstone blinked as the soft voice of her former Governor-General on Hyperion, young Lane, gave a quick summary of the meeting with the Ouster Tribunal. Gladstone sat back in the leather seat and raised both fists to her cheeks as Lane repeated the Ouster denials. They were not the invaders. Lane completed the transmit. I don't know what's going on today. I've commented on this before, but I swear I don't live in a particularly busy area, but we are kind of a central hub town for a lot of, radiating smaller towns. We're a throughway, so stuff like police and fire services are active for a multitude of areas in the surrounding vicinity. Vicinity. Where were we? They were not the invaders. Lane completed the transmission with a brief description of the swarm, his opinion that the ousters were telling the truth, a comment that the consul's fate was still unknown, and a request for orders.
Response.
Asked the Fatline computer.
Acknowledge the receipt of message, said Gladstone. Transmit stand by in diplomatic one-time code.
Gladstone keyed the second message. Admiral William Ahunta Lee appeared in a broken flat image projection, his ship's Fatline transmitter obviously working on reduced energy. Gladstone saw from the peripheral data columns that the squirt had been encrypted among standard fleet telemetry transmissions. Force technicians would eventually notice the checksum discrepancies, but it might be hours or days from now. Lee's face was bloodied, and the background was obscured by smoke. From the fuzzy black and white image, it appeared to Gladstone that the young man was transmitting from a docking bay of his cruiser. On a metal work table behind him lay a corpse. A complement of Marines managed to board one of their so-called Lancers, panted Lee. They are manned, 5 to a ship, and they do look like ousters, but watch what happens when we try to carry out an autopsy. The picture shifted, and Gladstone realized that Lee was using a handheld imager patched in through the cruiser's fatline transmitter. Now Lee was gone, and she was looking down into the white, damaged face of a dead ouster. From the bleeding at the eyes and ears, Gladstone guessed that the man had died of explosive decompression. Lee's hand appeared, recognizable by the Admiral's braid on the sleeve, holding a laser scalpel. The young commander did not bother to remove clothing before beginning a vertical incision starting at the breastbone and cutting downward. The hand with the laser jerked away, and the camera steadied as something began to happen with the ouster's corpse. Broad patches began to smolder on the dead man's chest, as if the laser had ignited clothing. Then the uniform burned through, and it was immediately apparent that the man's chest was burning in widening, irregular holes, and from those holes shone a light so brilliant that the portable imager had to stop down receptivity. Patches of the corpse's skull were burning through now, leaving afterimages on the fatline screen and Gladstone's retinas. The camera had pulled back before the corpse had been consumed, as if the heat were too great to bear. Lee's face floated into focus. You see, CEO, that's been the case with all of the bodies. We captured none alive. We found no center to the swarm yet, just more warships, and I think that... The image disappeared, and data columns said that the squirt had ceased in mid-transmission.
Response.
Gladstone shook her head and unsealed the cubicle. In her study once again, she looked longingly at the long couch and sat behind her desk, knowing that if she closed her eyes for a second, she would be asleep. Sedeptra buzzed on her private comlog frequency and said that General Morpurgo needed to see the CEO on an urgent matter. The Lucian entered and began pacing back and forth in agitation.
Executive, I understand your reasoning in authorizing the use of this Death Wand device, but I have to protest.
Why, Arthur? She asked, calling him by name for the first time in weeks.
Because we goddamn well don't know the result. It's too dangerous, and it's immoral.
Gladstone raised an eyebrow.
Losing billions of citizens in a protracted war of attrition would be moral, but using this thing to kill millions would be immoral? Losing billions of citizens in a protracted war of attrition would be moral, but using this thing to kill millions would be immoral? Is this the Force position, Arthur?
It's my position, CEO.
Gladstone nodded.
Understood and noted, Arthur, but the decision has been made and will be implemented.
She saw her old friend draw himself to attention, and before he could open his mouth to protest, or, more likely, offer his resignation, Gladstone said,
Would you take a walk with me, Arthur?
The Force General was nonplussed.
A walk? Why?
We need the fresh air.
Without waiting for a further response, Gladstone crossed to her private Farcaster, keyed the manual disk key, and stepped through. Morpurgo stepped through the opaque portal, glared down at the gold grass which rose to his knees and spread to a distant horizon, and raised his face to a saffron yellow sky where bronze cumulus clouds rose in jagged spires. Behind him, the portal winked out of existence, its location marked only by the meter-high control disk key, the only man-made thing visible in the endless reach of gold grass and cloud-filled sky.
Where the hell are we?
He demanded. Gladstone had pulled a long strand of grass and was chewing on it.
Castrop Roselle. It has no datasphere, no orbital devices, no human or mech habitations of any kind.
Morpurgo snorted.
Probably no safer from core surveillance than the places Byron Lamia used to take us, Mina.
Perhaps not, said Gladstone. Arthur, listen.
She activated the comlog recordings of the two fatline transmissions she had just heard. When they were finished, when Lee's face snapped out of existence, Morpurgo walked away through the high grass.
Well?
Asked Gladstone, hurrying to keep up.
So these ouster bodies self-destruct the same way cybrid corpses have been known to, he said. So what? Do you think the Senate or all thing will accept this as proof that it's the core that's behind the invasion?
Gladstone sighed. The grass looked soft, inviting. She imagined lying there and sinking into a nap from which she would never have to return.
It's proof enough for us, for the group.
Gladstone did not have to elaborate. Since her early Senate days, they had kept in touch with their suspicions of the Corps, their hope for true freedom from AI domination someday. When Senator Byron Lamia had led them, but that was long ago. Morpurgo watched wind whip at the golden steps. A curious type of ball lightning played inside the bronze clouds near the horizon.
So what? Knowing is useless unless we know where to strike.
We have 3 hours.
Morpurgo looked at his comm log.
2 hours and 42 minutes. Hardly time enough for a miracle, Mina.
Gladstone did not smile.
Hardly time enough for anything else, Arthur.
She touched the disk key, and the portal hummed to life.
What can we do?
Asked Morpurgo.
The core AIs are briefing our technicians on that Death Wand device right now. The torch ship will be ready in an hour.
We detonate it where the effect will harm no one, said Gladstone.
The general quit pacing and stared.
Where the hell is that? The fucker Nansen says that the device has a lethal radius of at least 3 light years, but how can we trust him? We set off one device, near Hyperion or anywhere else, and we may be dooming human life everywhere.
I have an idea, but I want to sleep on it, said Gladstone.
Sleep on it?
Growled General Morpurgo.
I'm going to take a short nap, Arthur, Gladstone said. I suggest you do the same.
She stepped through the portal. Morpurgo muttered a single obscenity, adjusted his cap, and walked through the Farcaster with head up, back straight, and eyes forward. A soldier marching to his own execution. On the highest terrace of a mountain moving through space some 10 light minutes from Hyperion, the consul and 17 ousters sat on a circle of low stones within a wider circle of taller stones and decided whether the consul would live. Your wife and child died on Brescia, said Freeman Genga, during the war between that world and Clan Mosman. Yes, said the consul. The Hegemony thought that the entire swarm was involved in the attack. I said nothing to disabuse them of that opinion. But your wife and child were killed. The consul looked beyond the stone circle toward the summit already turning toward night. So what? I ask for no mercy from this tribunal. I suggest no extenuating circumstances. I killed your Freeman Andil and 3 technicians. Killed them with premeditation and malice aforethought. Killed them with no other goal than to trigger your machine to open the time tombs. It had nothing to do with my wife and child. A bearded ouster, whom the consul had heard introduced as spokesman Hulkair Amnion, stepped forward to the inner circle. The device was useless. It did nothing. The consul turned, opened his mouth, and closed it without speaking. A test, said Freeman Genga. The consul's voice was almost inaudible. But the tombs opened.
We knew when they would open, said Cordwell Minmun. The decay rate of the anti-entropic fields was known to us. The device was a test.
A test, repeated the consul. I killed those 4 people for nothing. A test. Your wife and child died at ouster hands, said Freeman Genga. The hegemony raped your world of Maui Covenant. Your actions were predictable within certain parameters. Gladstone counted on this. So did we. But we had to know those parameters. The consul stood, took 3 steps, and kept his back turned to the others. Wasted. What was that? Asked Freeman Genga. The tall woman's bare scalp glowed in the starlight and the reflected sunlight from a passing comet farm. The consul was laughing softly. Everything wasted. Even my betrayals. Nothing real. Wasted. Spokesman Cordwell Minmun stood and arranged his robes.
This tribunal has passed sentence,
he said. The other 16 ousters nodded. The consul turned. There was something like eagerness on his tired face. Do it then. For God's sake, get it over with. Spokesman Freeman Genga stood and faced the consul. You are condemned to live. You are condemned to repair some of the damage you have done. The consul staggered as if struck in the face. No, you can't. You must.
You are condemned to enter the age of chaos which approaches,
said spokesman Hulkair Amnion.
Condemned to help us find fusion between the separated families of humankind.
The consul raised his arms as if trying to defend himself from physical blows. I can't! Won't! Guilty! Freeman Genga took 3 strides, grasped the consul by the front of his formal bolo jacket, and shook him unceremoniously. You are guilty, and that is precisely why you must help ameliorate the chaos which is to come. You helped free the Shrike. Now you must return to see that it is caged once again. Then the long reconciliation must begin. The consul had been released, but his shoulders were still shaking. At that moment, the mountain rotated into sunlight, and tears sparkled in the consul's eyes. No, he whispered. Freeman Genga smoothed his rumpled jacket and moved her long fingers to the diplomat's shoulders. We have our own prophets. The Templars will join us in the reseeding of the galaxy. Slowly, those who had lived in the lie called the Hegemony will climb out of the ruins of their core-dependent worlds and join us in true exploration. Each exploration of the universe and... Oh, sorry. I misread a line. Slowly, those who had lived in the lie called the Hegemony will climb out of the ruins of their core-dependent worlds and join us in true exploration. Exploration of the universe and of that greater realm which is inside each of us. The consul had not seemed to have heard. He turned away brusquely. The core will destroy you, he said, not facing any of them, just as it has destroyed the Hegemony.
Do you forget that your homeworld was founded on a solemn covenant of life?
Said Cordwell Minmun. The consul turned toward the ouster.
Such a covenant governs our lives and actions,
said Minmun,
not merely to preserve a few species from old Earth, but to find unity in diversity, to spread the seed of humankind to all worlds, diverse environments, while treating as sacred the diversity of life we find elsewhere.
Freeman Genga's face was bright in the sun. The core offered unity in unwitting subservience, she said softly, safety in stagnation. Where are the revolutions in human thought and culture and action since the Hegira?
Terraformed into pale clones of old Earth,
answered Cordwell Minmun.
Our new age of human expansion will terraform nothing. We will revel in hardships and welcome strangeness. We will not make the universe adapt. We shall adapt.
Spokesman Holker Amnion gestured toward the stars.
If humankind survives this test, our future lies in the dark distances between, as well as on the sunlit worlds.
The consul sighed. I have friends on Hyperion, he said. May I return to them? You may, said Freeman Genga. And confront the Shrike? Said the consul.
You will,
said Cordwell Minmun. And survive to see this age of chaos? Said the consul.
You must,
said Holker Amnion. The consul sighed again and moved aside with the others as, above them, a great butterfly with wings of solar cells and glistening skin impervious to hard vacuum or harder radiation, lowered itself toward the Stonehenge circle and opened its belly to receive the consul. In the government house infirmary on Tau Ceti Center, Father Paul de Rey slept a shallow and medically induced sleep, dreaming of flames and the death of worlds. Except for the brief visit by CEO Gladstone and an even briefer visit by Bishop Edouard, de Rey had been alone all day, drifting in and out of a pain-filled haze. The doctors here had asked for 12 more hours before their patient should be moved, and the College of Cardinals on Pachim had agreed, wishing the patient well and making ready for the ceremonies, still 24 hours away, in which Jesuit priest Paul de Rey of Villefranche-sur-Saône would become Pope Teilhard I, the 487th Bishop of Rome, direct successor of the disciple Peter. Still healing, fresh reweaving itself with the guidance of a million RNA directors, nerves similarly regenerating, thanks to the miracle of modern medicine. But not so miraculous, de Rey thought, that it keeps me from itching almost to death. The Jesuit lay abed and thought about Hyperion and the Shrike and his long life and the confused state of affairs in God's universe. Eventually, de Rey slept and dreamed of God's grove burning, while the Templar true voice of the world tree pushed him through the portal, and of his mother, and of a woman named Semfa, now dead, but formerly a worker on Perecibo Plantation in the outback. Formerly a worker on Perecibo Plantation in the outback of the outback, in fiberplastic country east of Port Romance. Yes, no, it says in the outback of the outback with a capital O. In fiberplastic country east of Port Romance. And in these dreams, primarily sad, de Rey suddenly was aware of another presence there. Not of another dream presence, but of another dreamer. One sec. I just flipped a page by accident. There we go. De Rey was walking with someone. The air was cool, and the sky was a heart-rending blue. They had just come around a bend in the road, and now a lake became visible before them, its shores lined with graceful trees, mountains framing it from behind, a line of low clouds adding drama and scale to the scene, and a single island seeming to float far out on the mirror-still waters. Lake Windermere, said de Rey's companion. The Jesuit turned slowly, his heart pounding with anxious anticipation. Whatever he expected, the sight of his companion did not inspire awe. A short young man walked next to de Rey. He wore an archaic jacket with leather buttons and a broad leather belt, sturdy shoes, an old fur cap, a battered knapsack, oddly tailored and frequently patched trousers, and carried a great plaid thrown over one shoulder, and a solid walking stick in his right hand. Duray stopped walking, and the other man paused as if welcoming a break. "The fells of Furness and the Cumbrian mountains," said the young man, using his stick to gesture beyond the lake. Duray saw the auburn locks curling out from under the odd cap, noted the large hazel eyes and the man's short stature, and knew that he had to be dreaming, even as he thought, "I'm not dreaming." "Who?" began Duray, feeling fear surge in him as his heart pounded. "John," said his companion, and the quiet reasonableness of that voice set some of Duray's fear aside. "I believe we'll be able to stay in Bowness tonight. Brown tells me that there's a wonderful inn there, hard on the lake." Duray nodded. He had absolutely no idea what the man was talking about. The short young man leaned forward and grasped Duray's forearm in a gentle but persistent grip. "There will be one who comes after me," said John. "Neither Alpha nor Omega, but essential for us to find the way." Duray nodded stupidly. A breeze rippled the lake and brought the smell of fresh vegetation from the foothills beyond. "That one will be born far away," said John. "Farther away than our race has known for centuries. Your job will be the same as mine now, to prepare the way. You will not live to see the day of that person's teaching, but your successor will." "Yes," said Paul Duray, and found that there was no saliva whatsoever in his mouth. The young man doffed his cap, tucked it in his belt, and stooped to pick up a rounded stone. He threw it far out onto the lake. Ripples spread in slow progression. "Damn," said John. "I was trying to skip it." He looked at Duray. "You have to leave the infirmary and get back to Pachem at once. Do you understand?" Duray blinked. The statement did not seem to belong in the dream. "Why?" "Never mind. Never mind," said John. "Just do it. Wait for nothing. If you don't leave at once, there will be no chance later." Duray turned in confusion, as if he could walk back to his hospital bed. He looked over his shoulder at the short, thin young man standing on the pebbly shore. "What about you?" John picked up a second stone, threw it, and shook his head when the rock skipped only once before disappearing beneath the mirrored surface. "I'm happy here for now," he said, more to himself than to Duray. "I really was happy on this trip. I really was happy on this trip." He seemed to shake himself out of his reverie, and lifted his head to smile at Duray. "Go on. Move your ass, Holiness. Move your ass, Your Holiness." Shocked, amused, irritated, Duray opened his mouth to retort and found himself lying in bed in the Government House infirmary. The medics had lowered the lighting so that he could sleep. Monitor beads clung to his skin. Duray lay there a minute, suffering the itching and discomfort from healing third-degree burns, and thinking about the dream, thinking that it was only a dream, that he could go back to sleep, for a few hours before Bishop Edouard and the others arrived to escort him back. Duray closed his eyes and remembered the masculine but gentle face, the hazel eyes, the archaic dialect. Father Paul Duray of the Society of Jesus sat up, struggled to his feet, found his clothes gone and nothing but his paper hospital pajamas to wear, wrapped a blanket around him, and shuffled off in bare feet before medics could respond to the tattletale censors. There had been a medics-only Farcaster at the far end of the hall. If that failed to get him home, he would find another. Leigh Hunt carried Keats's body out of the shadow of the building into the sunlight of the Piazza di Spagna and expected to find the Shrike waiting for him. Instead, there was a horse. Hunt wasn't an expert at recognizing horses, since the species was extinct in his time, but this one appeared to be the same one which had brought them to Rome. It helped in the identification that the horse was attached to the same small cart. Keats had called it a vettura, which they had ridden in earlier. Hunt set the body on the carriage seat, folding the layers of linen around it carefully, and walked alongside with one hand still touching the shroud as the carriage began moving slowly. In his final hours, Keats had asked to be buried in the Protestant cemetery near the Aurelian Wall and the pyramid of Caius Cestius. Hunt vaguely remembered that they had passed through the Aurelian Wall during their bizarre voyage here, but he could not have found it again if his life, or Keats's burial, depended on it. At any rate, the horse seemed to know the way. Hunt trudged alongside the slowly moving carriage, aware of the beautiful spring morning quality to the air and an underlying smell as of rotting vegetation. Could Keats's body be decomposing already? Hunt knew little about the details of death. He wanted to learn no more. He swatted at the horse's rump to hurry the beast up, but the animal stopped, turned slowly to give Hunt a reproachful look, and resumed his plodding pace. It was more a glint of light glimpsed out of the corner of his eye than any sound that tipped Hunt off, but when he turned quickly, the shrike was there, 10 or 15 meters behind, and marching the pace of the horse with a solemn but somehow comical march, thorned and barbed knees high with each step. Sunlight flashed on carapace, metal tooth, and blade. Hunt's first impulse was to abandon the carriage and run, but a sense of duty and a deeper sense of being lost stifled that urge. Where could he run but back to the Piazza di Spagna? And the shrike blocked the only return. Accepting the creature as a mourner in this insane procession, Hunt turned his back on the monster and continued walking alongside the carriage, one hand firm on his friend's ankle, through the shroud. All during the walk, Hunt was alert for any sign of a Farcaster portal, some sign of technology beyond the 19th century, or another human being. There was none. The illusion that he was walking through an abandoned Rome in the spring-like weather of February A.D. 1821 was perfect. The horse climbed a hill a block from the Spanish Steps, made several other turns on broad avenues and narrow lanes, and passed within sight of the curved and crumbling ruin which Hunt recognized as the Colosseum. When the horse and carriage stopped, Hunt roused himself from the walking doze he had drifted into and looked around. They were outside the overgrown heap of stones Hunt guessed to be the Aurelian Wall, and there was indeed a low pyramid visible, but the Protestant cemetery, if that is what it was, seemed more pasture than cemetery. Sheep grazed in the shade of cypresses, their bells tinkling eerily in the thick, warming air, and everywhere the grass grew to knee-height or taller. Hunt blinked and saw the few headstones scattered here and there, half hidden by the grass, and closer, just beyond the grazing horse's neck, a newly excavated grave. The shrike remained 10 meters back, among the rustling cypress branches, but Hunt saw the glow of its red eyes fixed on the gravesite. Hunt went around the horse, now munching contentedly on high grass, and approached the grave. There was no coffin. The hole was about 4 feet deep, and the heaped dirt beyond smelled of upturned humus and cool soil. Embedded there was a long-handled shovel, as if the gravediggers had just left. A slab of stone stood upright at the head of the grave, but remained unmarked, a blank headstone. Hunt saw the glint of metal on top of the slab and rushed over to find the first modern artifact he had seen since being kidnapped to Old Earth. A small laser pen lay there, the type used by construction workers or artists to scrawl designs on the hardest alloy. Hunt turned, holding the pen, feeling armed now, although the thought of that narrow beam stopping the shrike seemed ludicrous. He dropped the pen into the pocket of his shirt and went about the business of burying John Keats. A few minutes later, Hunt stood near the heap of dirt, shovel in hand, staring down into the... One sec.
It better be a robbery or something. I don't know. Where were we?
A few minutes later, Hunt stood near the heap of dirt, shovel in hand, staring down into the open grave at the small, sheet-wrapped bundle there, and tried to think of something to say. Hunt had been at numerous state memorial services, had even written Gladstone's eulogies for some of them, and words had never been a problem before. But now nothing came. The only audience was the silent shrike, still back among the shadows of the cypresses, and the sheep with their bells tinkling as they moved nervously away from the monster, ambling toward the grave like a group of tardy mourners. Hunt thought that perhaps some of the original John Keats poetry would be appropriate now, but Hunt was a political manager, not a man given to reading or memorizing ancient poetry. He remembered, too late, that he had written down the snippet of verse his friend had dictated the day before, but the notebook still lay in the bureau at the apartment on the Piazza di Spagna. It had been something about becoming godlike, or a god, the knowledge of too many things rushing in, or some such nonsense. Hunt had an excellent memory, but he couldn't recall the first line of that archaic mishmash. In the end, Leigh Hunt compromised with a moment of silence, his head bowed and his eyes closed except for occasional peeks at the shrike, still holding its distance. And then he shoveled the dirt in. It took longer than he would have imagined. When he was done patting down the soil, the surface was slightly concave, as if the body had been too insignificant to form a proper mound. Sheep brushed by Hunt's legs to graze on the high grass, daisies and violets which grew around the grave. Hunt might not have remembered the man's poetry, but he had no trouble remembering the inscription Keats had asked to be set on his headstone. Hunt clicked on the pen, tested it by burning a furrow in 3 meters of grass and soil, and then had to stamp out the tiny fire he had started. The inscription had bothered Hunt when he first heard it, the loneliness and bitterness audible beneath Keats's wheezing, gasping effort to speak. But Hunt did not think it was his place to argue with the man. Now he had only to inscribe it in stone, leave this place, and avoid the shrike while trying to find a way home. The pen sliced into stone easily enough, and Hunt had to practice on the back side of the headstone before he found the right depth of line and quality of control. Still, the effect looked ragged and homemade when Hunt finished some 15 or 20 minutes later. First, there was a crude drawing which Keats had asked for. He had shown the aide several rough sketches, drawn on foolscap with a shaking hand, of a Greek lyre with 4 of its 8 strings broken. Hunt was not satisfied when he was done. He was even less of an artist than a reader of poetry. But the thing was probably recognizable to anyone who knew what the hell a Greek lyre was. Then came the legend itself, written precisely as Keats had dictated it. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. There was nothing else. No birth or death dates, not even the poet's name. Hunt stood back, surveyed his work, shook his head, keyed the pen off but kept it in his hand, and started back for the city, making a wide circle around the creature in the cypresses as he did so. At the tunnel through the Aurelian wall, Hunt paused to look back. Still wailing sirens. The horse, still attached to its carriage, had moved down the long slope to munch on sweeter grass near a small stream. The sheep milled about, munching flowers and leaving their hoofprints in the moist soil of the grave. The shrike remained where it had been, barely visible beneath its bower of cypress branches. Hunt was almost sure that the creature still faced the grave. Give me a sec. I need to respond to someone on a phone. If it's not one thing, it's another. Give me 1 sec. Let that last scene sink in, I guess, for dramatic emotional effect.
Sorry about that. For some reason, the electronic lock on the apartment complex I live in decided to get engaged, and someone got locked out for no reason. Not their fault. I don't know what's going on. So I had to rescue them. Sorry about that. Fortunately, I live reasonably near the set of stairs and door where that was. Okay, where were we? Ah, yes. It was late in the afternoon when Hunt found the Farcaster, a dull rectangle of dark blue humming in the precise center of the crumbling Colosseum. There was no disk key or punch plate. The portal hung there like an opaque but open door. But not open to Hunt. He tried 50 times, but the surface was as solid and resisting as stone. He touched it tentatively with his fingertips, stepped confidently into and bounced off its surface, threw himself at the blue rectangle, lobbed stones at the entrance to watch them bounce off, tried both sides and even the edges of the thing, and ended up leaping again and again at the useless thing until his shoulders and upper arms were masses of bruises. It was a Farcaster. He was sure of it, but it would not let him through. Hunt searched the rest of the Colosseum, even the underground passages dripping with moisture and bat guano, but there was no other portal. He searched the nearby streets and all their buildings. No other portal. He searched all afternoon through basilica and cathedrals, homes and huts, grand apartment buildings and narrow alleys. He even returned to the Piazza di Spagna, ate a hasty meal on the first floor, pocketed the notebook and anything else he found of interest in the rooms above, and then left forever to find a Farcaster. The one in the Colosseum was the only one he could find. By sunset, he had clawed at it until his fingers were bloody. It looked right, it hummed right, it felt right, but it would not let him through. A moon, not old Earth's moon, judging by the dust storms and clouds visible on its surface, had risen and now hung above the black curve of the Colosseum wall. Hunt sat in the rocky center and glowered at the blue glow of the portal. From somewhere behind him came the frenzied beat of pigeons' wings and the rattle of small rock on stone. Hunt rose painfully, fumbled the laser pen out of his pocket, and stood, legs apart, waiting and straining to see into the shadows of the Colosseum's many crevices and arches. Nothing stirred. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl and almost spray the thin beam of laser light across the Farcaster portal's surface. An arm appeared there, then a leg. A person emerged, then another. The Colosseum echoed to Leigh Hunt's shouts. Maina Gladstone had known that as tired as she was, it would be folly to nap even as long as 30 minutes. But since childhood, she had trained herself to take 5 to 15-minute cat naps, shrugging off weariness and fatigue toxins through these brief respites from thought. Now, sickened with exhaustion and the vertigo of the previous 48 hours' confusion, she lay a few minutes on the long sofa in her study, emptying her mind of trivia and redundancies, letting her subconscious find a path through the jungle of thoughts and events. For a few minutes she dozed, and while she dozed, she dreamed. Mina Gladstone sat upright, shrugging off the light Afghan and tapping at her comlog before her eyes were open.
Sadeptra, get General Morpurgo and Admiral Singh in my office in 3 minutes.
Gladstone stepped into the adjoining bathroom, showered and sonicked, pulled out fresh clothes, her most formal suit of soft, black whipcord velvet, a gold and red Senate scarf held in place by a gold pin showing the geodesic symbol of the Hegemony, earrings dating back to pre-mistake Old Earth, and the topaz bracelet cum comlog given to her by Senator Byron Lamia before his marriage, and was back in the study in time to greet the two force officers.
CEO, this is very unfortunate timing, began Admiral Singh. The final data from Mare Infinitus was being analyzed, and we were discussing fleet movements for the defense of Asquith.
Gladstone ordered her private Farcaster into existence and gestured for the two men to follow her. Singh glanced around as he stepped through into gold grass under a threatening bronze sky.
Gastrop Rauzel, he said. There were rumors that a previous administration had forced Space Construct a private Farcaster here.
CEO Yevshensky had it added to the web, said Gladstone.
She waved, and the Farcaster door vanished. Getting real tired of these sirens, I tell you what. Oh, nice, they cut off early.
CEO Yevshensky had it added to the web, said Gladstone.
She waved, and the Farcaster door vanished.
He felt that the chief executive needed some place where core listening devices were unlikely.
Morpurgo looked uneasily toward a wall of clouds near the horizon where the ball lightning played.
No place is totally safe from the core, he said. I've been telling
Oh, sorry, that's Morpurgo. No place is totally safe from the core, he said. I've been telling Admiral Singh about our suspicions.
Not suspicions, said Gladstone. Facts. And I know where the core is.
Both force officers reacted as if the ball lightning had struck them.
Where?
They said almost in unison. Gladstone paced back and forth. Her short gray hair seemed to glow in the charged air.
In the Farcaster web, she said, between the portals. The AIs live in the Singularity pseudo-world there like spiders in a dark web, and we wove it for them.
Morpurgo was the first of the two able to speak.
My God, he said. What do we do now? We have less than 3 hours before the torch ship with the core device translates to Hyperion space.
Gladstone told them exactly what they were going to do.
Impossible,
said Singh. He was unconsciously tugging at his short beard.
Simply impossible.
No, said Morpurgo. It will work. There is enough time. And as a frantic
And as frantic and random as the fleet movements have been during the past 2 days.
The Admiral shook his head.
Logistically, it might be possible. Rationally and ethically, it is not. No, it is impossible.
Mina Gladstone stepped closer.
Kushwant,
She said, addressing the Admiral by his first name for the first time since she had been a young senator and he an even younger Force Space commander.
don't you remember when Senator Lamia put us in touch with the stables? The AI named Ummon? His prediction of the two futures, one holding chaos and the other certain extinction for humankind.
Singh turned away.
My duty is to Force and the Hegemony.
Your duty is the same as mine, snapped Gladstone, to the human race.
Singh's fists came up as if he were ready to fight an invisible but powerful opponent.
We don't know for sure. Where did you get your information?
Severn, said Gladstone, the Cybrid.
Cybrid? Snorted the General. You mean that artist? Or at least the miserable excuse for one.
Cybrid,
repeated the CEO. She explained.
Severn is a retrieval persona? Morpurgo looked dubious. And now you've found him?
He found me in a dream. Somehow he managed to communicate from wherever he is. That was his role, Arthur Kushwant. That's why Ummon sent him to the web.
A dream, sneered Admiral Singh. This Cybrid told you that the core was hidden in the Farcaster web in a dream.
Yes, said Gladstone, and we have very little time in which to act.
But, said Morpurgo, to do what you suggested. Would do millions, finished Singh. Possibly billions. The economy would collapse. Worlds like TC Squared, Renaissance Vector, New Earth, the Denims, New Mecca, Lusus, Arthur. Scores more depend upon other worlds for their food. Urban planets cannot survive alone.
Not as urban planets, said Gladstone, but they can learn to farm until interstellar trade is reborn.
Bah! Snarled Singh. After plague, after the breakdown of authority, after the millions of deaths from lack of proper equipment, medicine, and datasphere support.
I've thought of all that, said Gladstone,
her voice firmer than Morpurgo had ever heard it.
I'll be the greatest mass murderer in history, greater than Hitler or Tsehu or Horace Glennon Height. The only thing worse is to continue as we are. In which case, I, and you, gentlemen, will be the ultimate betrayers of humankind.
We can't know that,
grunted Kushwant Singh, as if the words were driven from him by blows to the belly.
We do know that, said Gladstone. The core has no more use for the web. From now on, the Volatiles and the Ultimates will keep a few million slaves penned underground on the 9 labyrinthine worlds while they use the human synapses for what computing needs remain.
Nonsense, said Singh. The humans would die out.
Mina Gladstone sighed and shook her head.
The core has devised a parasitic organic device called the cruciform, she said. It brings back the dead. After a few generations, the humans will be retarded, listless, and without a future, but their neurons will still serve core purposes.
Singh turned his back on them again. His small form was silhouetted against a wall of lightning as the storm approached in a riot of boiling bronze clouds.
Your dream told you this, Mina?
Yes.
And what else does your dream say?
Snapped the Admiral.
That the core has no more need for the web, said Gladstone. Not for the human web. They'll continue to reside there, rats in the walls, but the original occupants are no longer needed. The AI Ultimate Intelligence will take over the major computing duties.
Singh turned to look at her.
You are mad, Mina. Quite mad.
Gladstone moved quickly to grab the Admiral's arm before he could activate the Farcaster.
Kushwant, please, listen to...
Singh pulled a ceremonial flechette pistol from his tunic and set it against the woman's breast. I am sorry, Executive, but I serve the Hegemony and... Gladstone stepped back with her hand to her mouth as Admiral Kushwant Singh stopped speaking, stared sightlessly for a second, and fell to the grass. The flechette pistol tumbled into the weeds. Morpurgo stepped forward to retrieve it, tucking it into his belt before he put away the death wand in his hand.
You killed him, said the CEO. If he wouldn't cooperate, I'd plan to leave him here, maroon him on Castrop Roselle.
We couldn't take the chance,
said the general, pulling the body farther from the Farcaster.
Everything depends upon the next few hours.
Gladstone looked at her old friend.
You're willing to go through with it?
We have to, said Morpurgo. It will be our last chance to get rid of this yoke of oppression. I'll give the deployment orders at once and hand over sealed orders in person. It will take most of the fleet.
My God, whispered Mina Gladstone, looking down at the body of Admiral Singh. I'm doing all of this on the strength of a dream.
Sometimes, said General Morpurgo, taking her hand, dreams are all that separate us from the machines.
And that is where we will call it for this week. Next week is the finale. It's everything. It's the end. The end of all things. The Götterdämmerung. The twilight of the gods. It's going to be awesome. Hope people are enjoying. I know I certainly am. It's definitely one of my personal favorites. And I know other people had wanted it. So hopefully they're digging it too. After next week, I will probably do one of these short story collections by Greg Egan. That's what I'm thinking before I get started on alternating between the Destination Void series by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom and the Three Body Problem trilogy by Cixin Liu. Which reminds me, I really need to get cracking on rereading The Dark Forest, so I have something in my head for what I'm going to do for that. Even though that's not going to be for months. Months! At any rate, hope people are digging it. If you are tuning into this for the first time, hello! Hi! Welcome. I do these every week, every Friday on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. This has been a segment from The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. If you are listening to this after the fact, I do them live, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time or U.S. East Coast time. I also do readings on Mondays and Wednesdays. Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now we're going through Waldo by Robert Heinlein. And then Wednesdays right now are Wuxia Wednesdays, and right now we're reading through Legends of the Condor Heroes, Book 1, A Hero Born by Jin Yong, which is a fun martial fantasy adventure. Quite a lot of fun. But yeah, thanks to everyone who tuned in or will tune in the future. Hi, I'm speaking to you from the past. And yeah, have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. And don't let the rats in the walls feeding on your neurons and using them for processing power as you walk through the wormhole network get you down. Until next time.